challenger, we have somebody who's going to argue circles around me and set me straight. So I get it. Your satirical profile is white pill, correct?
Yeah, White Pill Pro is my
Pro.
Twitter. Yeah, it's my Twitter and YouTube name.
Okay. And what exactly is it that you take issue with? You said that I believe in aliens and Moses is going to fight the aliens. Of course, that's not true. So I think you're trying to be funny, but what exactly is it that you think is so absurd about what I talk about?
Yeah, well, that was just a joke. That was just an exaggeration, that part. But I'm more interested in why do you think Darwinism causes like this kind of why Darwinism and what you call scientism causes the modern decline that we have right now, the modern moral decline. What is the connection between Darwinism and kind of the leftist crap we see going on?
Well, certainly Darwinism didn't begin on the modern left. It began as a movement out of the Freemasonic lodges by T.H. Huxley, Darwin, and other people in his circles, especially the Galton and Wedgwood and Huxley families are actually the pioneers of this. So they propagated it, and they weren't quote liberals. They were definitely committed to a Victorian philosophy about Anglo supremacy. However, in time, that worldview modified to become something that is nowadays associated with progressivism and leftism. Now, of course, there are many on the right who still maintain the Darwinian ethos, but I think that it's not too difficult, or it shouldn't even be that controversial to understand that the shift away from traditional ideas of philosophy, which dealt with metaphysics, ethics, and epistemology, that there was a specific set of criteria and categories that aren't compatible with the materialistic ethos of Darwinism. Now, I recognize that there are plenty of Darwinists who are not necessarily committed to materialism, but most of the time, probably 95% of the time, Darwinism goes hand in hand with a very materialistic ethos. It's also accompanied by ideas like pragmatism or radical or naive empiricism. So naive empiricism is very easily deconstructed. And if you understand that Darwinism is, again, 95% of the time connected to naive empiricism, I mean, it's really a no-brainer that that's connected to the social, political, religious, philosophical breakdown, because empiricism is not justifiable. It's essentially an anti-philosophical position.
Well, I don't see materialism, Darwinism, pragmatism, or empiricism as being the same thing as like modern leftism. So I don't see a necessary connection between empiricism and like the type of leftism we see right now.
You don't think that in the history of Western thought, empiricism and naive empiricism arose out of the revolutionary Enlightenment and liberal traditions? I mean, any of the Enlightenment thinkers you read would tell you this. You could read Locke, you could read Jefferson. They all have this view. Hume, Kant.
Are you saying that the empiricists and the Enlightenment were like two different schools? Like the empiricism was a reaction to
No,
the Enlightenment school?
empiricism came to dominate after the Enlightenment, after the British Enlightenment thinkers, especially the Scottish common sense thinkers, Thomas Paine, Locke, Jefferson, Berkeley. They're all out of the empiricist tradition. Hume, and that tradition is anti-metaphysical by its very nature. It opposes the ideas of objective categories, of absolutes. And it's like Hume said, logic is really something that can only be justified in terms of pragmatism. It's not something that's actually existing. So there's no doubt that the empirical tradition gave rise to modern liberalism. It should be a no-brainer.
I don't think so, because I think during the Enlightenment there are two different things that are part of the Enlightenment. There's the epistemology side of it, where it's about a rediscovery of science, of how we acquire knowledge, and then there's the other side, the moralistic side of it, which is about like universal human rights. This concept of universal human rights that has nothing to do with pragmatism. It has nothing to do with empirical reality. It's just something that kind of coincided with, the age of reason, the scientific revolution, and things like that. So I don't see.
Well, okay. Well, you know about nominalism, right?
No.
Okay. Well, nominalism is the late medieval movement that gave rise to empiricism. Okay. So this is again the anti-metaphysical movement of late medieval nominalists like Occam or Byle, and they taught that there's essentially there are no real categories when we speak of things like essences or when we make propositional claims, logic. Those things don't have any metaphysical existence. They're essentially just tokens, symbols, and signs, right? So nominalism, again, nobody doubts this. You could read countless philosophers that talk about the development of this tradition in the West that gave rise to empiricism. I mean, David Hume is in the tradition of the nominalists. Okay, you could read Kant's essay about the prolegomena to any future metaphysics. Kant talks about the fact that Hume destroyed the possibility of metaphysics, and so all that's left is radical empiricism. That tradition can't be divorced from the socio-political tradition of the time as well. And you see this in the rise of people like Locke's treatise on two governments. You see it in any of the revolutionary philosophers. They all adopt some form of empiricism. Bacon, right? Bacon wrote his famous essay about the idols of the theater, the idols of the public discourse, and so forth. And one of those idols is metaphysics. That it's not that government, that philosophy is not based on empirical data. It's based on armchair philosophizing, like Plato said. So the entire period, everything from the secret societies, the Rosicrucians, to the mainline philosophers like Locke, it's all connected to the same ideas, the same movements. I'm not saying there aren't differences between them. You're right to talk about the universalization of something like human rights, but even that, the Enlightenment philosophers tended to try to ground in something empirical, unless they believed in metaphysical absolutes. But that quickly dropped away. I mean, you see again, if you read Kant's essay, he makes it very clear that he doesn't think metaphysics can be done anymore. So the only people that continued to do metaphysics were continental philosophers, right, or religious philosophers. So again, Rousseau, Locke, Hume, Kant, they all talk about the connection between the revolution and the social sphere, with the revolution in epistemology and thought.
Well, there might just be, some major hole I have in my history or something here, but I still don't see the connection between, like, my argument would be that, like, people like Locke and Rousseau, they may have claimed to be empiricists, but they were really bad at it. Like when like I think like John Locke and Thomas Jefferson, they're kind of similar. And when like Thomas Jefferson says, it is self-evident that all men are created equal. Is that not a metaphysical claim?
Sure, they make metaphysical claims all the time, but they have again adopted an empiricist ethos from the Enlightenment. I mean, this is what undergirds the Enlightenment, is returning to, it's part of humanism. If you look at the humanist movement, okay, this would be people like Erasmus or even John Calvin. They were all part of the humanist movement prior to the Enlightenment, and the idea of the humanists was to return to the text, return to the original language. So people were trying to learn Greek and Hebrew and Latin to study original texts and not go by medieval aberrations. They wanted to get back to the originals. This flows out of the idea of humanism in the Renaissance, right? The Renaissance also wanted to return to Greek ideals and synthesize this. So a big part of the humanists was actually studying and learning these things empirically. That gave rise to later movements especially out of the Reformation. The Reformation is, you can't divorce that from the Enlightenment either. If the Reformation hadn't happened, you wouldn't have had the Enlightenment. So there's a whole bunch of different ideological currents that go into what gives rise to the scientific revolution. And again, everybody knows the scientific revolution comes out of the Enlightenment, and the scientific revolution would never have happened if there had not been a turn towards empiricism by many, many thinkers. And so, yes, you're right that many of them make metaphysical claims, but that's because they're not really consistent. you can't deny metaphysics on the one hand and then later make metaphysical claims. But a lot of people hadn't really thought through those possibilities, because most people at that time weren't doing what we do nowadays when we look at like presuppositions, or we look at foundations of systems. That just wasn't really in vogue in the middle, or in the Enlightenment period, except for Kant. Kant does a little bit of that, and then Hegel does it.
So do you think that those thinkers were logically inconsistent?
Absolutely.
So yeah, I completely agree with that. I would say that if people like Locke and Rousseau and all of them were to take their empiricism to their logical conclusions, then they wouldn't have any ideas. They wouldn't have all these like political systems in place, these beliefs of human rights and all of that.
Right. Yeah, I agree.
So, but do you think that that those ideas of like human rights and humanism, do you think that those were contradictory to like the traditional way, like the theological way? Do you think that humanism and what and like the Christian ethos, or do you think those are kind of similar?
I think that what happened is, over a period of time in the West, especially, you had a gradual divorcing of the idea of rights, the natural law, natural theology, that got divorced from the revealed theology. So what you see in Aquinas, when he, for example, makes classical arguments for God, so-called, which are bad arguments, by the way, or whether he talks about natural law, natural rights theory, eventually, because of the highly philosophical God that those systems proposed, that all it gets lost. So they eventually toss out the theology, and they try to retain a lot of the humanism. You read any of the French revolutionaries, and they do this. You see this in their liberty, equality, fraternity ideas, which are again bastardizations of older Christian principles. So yeah, I would say that there's absolutely no doubt that they tried to maintain a kind of humanism. You see this again in like somebody like the technocrats like Saint-Simon or Auguste Comte, who would be the forefathers of sociology. They were also Illuminists. They thought that you could basically set up a universal so-called Christian kingdom without Christianity, a demytholized Christianity, which gave birth to the eventual idea of technocracy. So they're actually the pioneer technocrats were Saint Just, Saint-Simon, and Auguste Comte. And they come out of the French revolutionary tradition. So that they're also radical empiricists, by the way. They gave rise to the idea of the panopticon of Bentham. And so panopticism is a great example of this. If you look at panopticism, you'll see how the left tradition, the progressive tradition, moves from empiricism and so-called human rights to the idea of a completely controlled society, because their ideas of the panopticon is the basis for the modern surveillance state. And so, in other words, you lose all your rights. So I think that there's always this contradiction in the revolutionary philosophers between, on the one hand, wanting to have this idea of democracy, and on the other hand, wanting to have some means by which you try to force everybody to be equal. And you see that with, somebody like Rousseau.
But wouldn't you say that these people trying to create these like utopias, these technocratic states or whatever, wouldn't that be more of a secularization? It would be the result of a secularization of Christianity, not so much a result of empiricism.
Well, I see those things as linked. I mean, the rise of the empirical tradition. If you read, there's a book that collects all the British empiricists together that we had in an undergrad. I think it's just called the British Empiricists. You'll see that tradition is linked to the socio-political movements of the time. It's not divorced. So you couldn't get, for example, Newtonian atomism without and what E. Michael Jones calls Whig economic theory, or what I've just critiqued most of the time as just laissez-faire free market stuff with like Ricardo and Adam Smith and all that. You couldn't get that without the corollary movements in ideology, which moved away from metaphysics. Again, the keystone document here is to look at somebody like Kant, the way he talks about how Hume has destroyed metaphysics. So if metaphysics has been destroyed, all we're left with is empiricism. So when Kant wrote Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics, he says, if we're going to ever be able to make metaphysical claims again after Hume has completely destroyed it, then we'll have to reformulate all of philosophy in some way to figure out how there's metaphysics, how it's even possible, how we can know anything in the external world. And this is accompanied by, at the exact same time across Europe, the idea that there's no longer a divine right of kings. Right? That doesn't exist because you can't empirically justify that. What you can empirically justify or come up with in some kind of weird justification would be something like social contract theory. So social contract theory is, I would say, 100% connected to the rise of the empiricist tradition. All of the original empiricists deny divine right and metaphysics. Well, they're inconsistent, I should say. They on the one hand want to deny metaphysics, but they also do make metaphysical claims, as you pointed out.
So it seems like so do you think that the problem, like the problem with the modern world is that basically people are trying to have like metaphysical systems in place without having like the existence of God, basically, or trying to get the advantages out of metaphysics without the traditional way of doing metaphysics?
I would say that's one angle of the problem, but it's not the problem. Sure, I mean, everybody has a philosophy, whether they know it or not. So they have an ethic, a metaphysic, and an epistemology, whether they know or not. Right, in my view, and so even if people are radical in their positions, like a radical materialist, and or like that guy I was debating the other day, the vegan guy, where he's like, I don't have to accept any overall ethical frame. I just have to be logical. I don't think that that's possible. I think anytime you engage in any branch of philosophy, you assume the other ones, whether you want to or not. It's sort of a necessary entailment type thing, in my view. So a lot of people think that they can erect systems where they don't require metaphysics, or they don't require any transcendental claims, or they don't require any kind of claims that go maybe beyond sense experience, right? But again, if you look at the history of critiques of something like naive empiricism, you can see how easily it breaks down. I mean, it's so easy to break that down that they can't even justify the past. They can't justify the existence of the self. They can't justify the existence of, something outside of the immediate spatiotemporal vision. And this leads to some, goofy, like Buddhist type stuff. Like, well, you can't believe that there is a tree, falling in a field if nobody sees it. That kind of stuff. It leads to that kind of absurdity. If you want to try to have, something like, well, I'm just going to be a radical empiricist. We're not going to have any metaphysics or ethics. We're just going to go with sense experience. I mean, this has been deconstructed by so many philosophers that it's pretty funny, actually, because it's completely self-destructive as a worldview.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say that I'm like completely in that camp. I believe like the exact opposite of what you believe, pretty much.
Okay, well, do you think that beliefs or claims have to be justified? I mean, have you read David Hume?
No, I haven't read Hume.
Well, I'm
kind of familiar with him. But
I would recommend Hume to you because he agrees with you. He's in your camp. And the reason I like Hume and people in my school like Hume is that we see him as being consistent, where he says, let's be consistent empiricists. If we are consistent, then we can't justify something like induction, or we can't justify something like the belief that the future will be like the past. We have no logical basis for believing that the sun will rise tomorrow. We believe that it will. There's not a logical justification for the belief that it will. And that's called, in science, philosophy of science, is called induction. So Hume is honest as an empiricist and says there's no basis, there's no logical basis for the scientific method and for induction. And you can read all the way up to the famous essay by William Van Orman Quine, who's the 20th century empiricist continuing the tradition, where he talks about the fact that there's still no justification for this. So Hume has never been refuted or explained from the empiricist camp. And even the top empiricists of the 20th century, like Quine, continue that argument that there's not a justification for induction.
Yeah, so this actually gets to really to the heart of the matter, and this actually reminds me. This is like the last time I got angry with things you've said was when you were arguing with JF, and you guys were arguing about God and logic and things like that. And I mean, the argument kind of seemed to come down to the idea that you believe that logic itself needs to be objectively justified. Like we have to have some kind of metaphysical standard of this thing called logic, and if that doesn't exist, then we can't make logical claims about the world. We can't make anything that we can't make any claims that we would consider to be in the category of logic because
Mhm.
we haven't objectively justified the existence of logic. um I mean, I don't see why you think that is true. Why can't you just possibly say that we
Because it's incoherent. It's a dogma. That's why Quine calls his essay Two Dogmas of Empiricism. He says every empiricist has two dogmatic beliefs that he can't justify. And those beliefs revolve around the uniformity of nature and the reliability of sense experience in terms of induction. That's a dogma, and it can't be justified. And the irony is that every person who has this empiricist bent, who doesn't question or has never questioned naive empiricism, is usually on a war to end dogmas and superstition. And the irony is that it's hypocritical because it rests on dogma, and the top empiricists still admit this.
if I'm using empirical faculties to come to the conclusion that empiricism is the best way to understand knowledge, then you can't say that that's contradictory. If I say my epistemology is empiricism, and you say, well, no, you can't. That's irrational um, because that's
Well, it's like this. It's
you
like
don't have any objective logic. Well, you're using a different epistemology than me.
well,
Well, I have
it's
to
like
assume your epistemology is true before argument.
well, it's like this. It's like earlier when I mentioned nominalism. This is kind of the point of the nominalists who were debating against sort of pseudo Platonists at the time, who were called realists. And realists believe that there's such a thing as universals. So, for example, if a person makes a universal claim, that would be in logic any claim that is all encompassing for that set or that scope of beings or objects or properties. So, for example, if you say all knowledge comes from experience, which is what most empiricists, naive empiricists say. And by the way, naive empiricist is not an attack. That's the name for the position. If anybody says all knowledge comes from experience, that's a universal claim in logic. So to be logical, if you're an empiricist, then you have to. I think, this is the usual criticism, is that you have to justify that claim by experience, but you can't because it's a universal claim. You can't prove or know by experience that all knowledge comes through experience.
Why can't I just say that the only thing I know from my experiences of being alive, of being a conscious being, are the things that I've taken in through sense data. Therefore, I'm going to use that information to form what I think is probable about the world, and that is my basis for knowledge.
Well, there's
So
a
why can't I
multitude
just
of
say that?
problems for that because the subject there is not something that is determined or derived by sense experience. The claim itself is a claim that includes meaning, which is not directly obtained from sense experience. In other words, when you make a claim like that, you're bringing words and concepts together that are not, strictly speaking, identical to the sense experiences that you have. And this is a really silly problem on the part of naive empiricism, that it assumes that the content of the proposition or the thoughts or the concepts in your mind, whatever you think those are, whether you think they're just electrical impulses or atoms or whatever, it assumes that the content is the exact same as the phenomena of your experience, and they're not. They're two different things. So you have to assume that there's meaningful content in your head that corresponds to the phenomena that you saw out there in the external world, assuming that you believe that there is an external world. So there's all kinds of assumptions that are not justifiable when we take a naive empiricist view. Namely, you can't justify the claim that all knowledge comes through sense experience or any of these other things. You can't justify the claim that you are a self that can make sense of these experiences, right? I mean, in other words, this is sometimes in philosophy it's called the problem of identity over time, or sometimes it's called the idea of a transcendental unity of consciousness, the idea that you are a being that has meaningful experiences over time, and that these experiences and thoughts that you have in your head, that they actually cohere and they have some connection between one another. Now, in a chaotic universe, they don't, but in a universe where there's meaning and order, it would make sense that you would have that. It would make sense how you can learn from the past and project into the future, right? Induction makes sense in a world that's orderly and regular. It doesn't make sense in a world that's chaotic, and that was Hume's whole point. Hume's whole point was that let's just be honest here and realize that we have to give up this idea that we can logically justify empiricism. We can't. It's a dogma.
Well, I mean, I feel like you're kind of stuck in the same situation. You know, whenever you talk to anybody about logic, you're having a conversation about it, and maybe you're not using empirical principles, but you're
Mhm.
using these objective, metaphysical, logical principles. I mean, even then, your entire conversation is dependent on sense experiences. So the information you're receiving, I mean, everything you're receiving, that might be biased, that might not be real. Everything you're saying might not,
Mhm.
be conveyed as being objective. There's nothing inherently objective about any
Yeah,
logical argument.
I see what you're saying. Well, I would say that this gets into a different kind of question, which is about the types of things that exist and if different types of things are proven or known in different ways. So, in my system, in my belief system, my worldview, not everything is known or proven the exact same way. So something like whether there's probability in terms of there being, whether Bill Cosby's in my backyard right now, right? That's a question of empiricism and probability. It's highly unlikely that he is, unless there's, drugged women out back or something. Then he's probably there. But normally speaking, right, I can have a reasonable probability belief that he's not in my backyard because it's highly unlikely. And the way that I would go about proving that is to go and look and see whether it is or isn't the case. So that's one type of thing that's known empirically, but other types of things are not known the exact same way. For example, we don't justify claims or know claims about, say, logic or advanced mathematics or number theory in this exact same way that we do that kind of stuff. Yes, at times numbers do relate to empirical sense data. If we're counting something, if we're constructing, a bridge on the basis of um, algorithms or computer or something like that, that logic or math and logic does come into play in the sensory phenomenal world. But the way that we know that those things are true, or the way that we explain them or justify them, is completely different than the way that we justify material objects, because by definition we don't think that numbers are material objects. So when you start with a position like something like radical materialism, you already have a bunch of metaphysical presuppositions that box you in, that don't allow for other types of arguments or other types of objects, right? Objects that have a different kind of ontological status than just something that's material or a collection of sense qualities. Numbers don't have um, any sense qualities to them. Even if you write them in time and space and erase them, they're not gone, right? 2 + 2 is still going to be 4 tomorrow, and that's because numbers, just like categories of logic and things like that, they're not like sensory things. So we, in our system, we don't start with the assumption that all that exists is material and that we can only know and believe in things based on sense data. For one, it's self-refuting, and there's also a lot of other types of things that we think exist, such as invariant abstract concepts or numbers or laws. Laws are not material. And I think they do have a real ontological existence. When we deny them ontological existence, we're led to some really absurd conclusions. And I think that in itself is an argument. It's a transcendental argument.
I think you could still be an empiricist, but still believe in not necessarily non-empirical things, but in abstract things. I mean, just because I consider myself an empiricist doesn't mean
Well, that's true.
I
Berkeley has your view. I mean, in other words, there is such a thing as a empirical idealism, but they're few and far between. Berkeley is really one of the few that I could think of. Some people argue that Kant kind of is a empirical idealist. So there are people who have toyed with that view. Platonism could tend towards being that kind of a view, but the problem is, again, that kind of a view. You can't prove by sense experience that all of reality is just sense data or a mental phenomena or just ideal or something like that, because it's a big level metaphysical claim.
I mean, I think everything can be material, but you could still have the existence of abstractions. Like a thought. Me perceiving a thought is not non-material.
Okay, but you don't perceive a thought through your senses. I mean, that's empiricism.
Well, see, that's a good point there. Yeah, I'm an atheist, but the whole problem of consciousness argument is actually the one argument that I'm really not sure on. It's hard for me to understand how you could go from the material to like the perception of a thought, or
Mm-hmm.
the non-material thing that is a thought.
Mm-hmm.
That's my one, the one thing I'm really not so sure about. But that's interesting. But I have to get going either way. But thanks for talking with me. This was pretty good.
Yeah, man, great talk, and you're always welcome to come back. We can have another chat.
All right, man. Thanks.
All right, have a good day. Later.